So yes, healthcare is complex, and one of the things we often don't talk about is the before and after when somebody becomes a patient. So when we talk about people with diabetes, for example, we kind of have this model in our mind of a person with diabetes. You might have stereotypes in mind, but you always think about them in the after effect. But nobody often thinks about the before and the after. And so that's really, really important. For me, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 14. And the way I relate this to other people who've not had a chronic healthcare experience is telling them that it's like being struck by lightning, right? There was no way for me to prepare or to know. We don't know what causes type 1 diabetes. We don't know who's going to get it. I just know there was a clear before and a clear after and what that meant for me. And it's also challenging because we think type 1 diabetes is easy. As a society, we know what to do. Take insulin, right? Eat healthy, take care of yourself. Well, even for somebody with type 1 diabetes, there's not as much stigma as there is tied with type 2 diabetes. But once you're a patient, there's still all these stigmas and all these things that are thrown at you. And I just want to ask, who here follows their doctor's recommendations for eating healthy and exercising perfectly? Yeah, nobody's raising their hands right now. And this is even worse when you become a patient because people look at you and they expect you to fall into the model of what you think they should do, which is unfortunate and hard. And in type 1 diabetes, again, we have tools that will help. We have things like insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitors, and people think, well, what more could you possibly want? Why are you failing to meet your treatment goals that are set to you by your doctor? Totally ignoring the contextual stuff that Eric talked about in terms of what that person's life is like. That person with type 1 diabetes may have just had their child be diagnosed with cancer, may have lost their job, may be struggling with this or that, and those things can all influence and impact the type 1 diabetes control, even though those things are not healthcare or type 1 diabetes impact. And the other thing people don't realize is that the tools that we are given to manage type 1 diabetes are not perfect. For example, most people don't know that insulin pumps are dumb. They're helpful because instead of having to inject multiple times a day, you have a pump that is pre-planned to give you certain amounts of insulin throughout the day. And you might think, well, that's great, right? So you don't have to think, it just gives you insulin. Well, what happens when your blood sugar goes low? You need less insulin. The pump doesn't know that your blood sugar went low. So by design, it overdoses you with insulin. Think about that. An insulin pump is designed to overdose you with insulin when your blood sugar is low. So that's not quite a perfect device, right? And so this might help you start to rethink, what are some of those assumptions we have about the devices and the tools that we give to people, thinking they're a step up. Yes, but they're not a cure, they're not perfect, they're not taking away all of these challenges. And another challenge for type 1 diabetes that I want to help articulate, which kind of underpins my work and how I got into the space, is understanding that diabetes is not just set and forget. With that dumb pump in the CGM, dozens of times a day, a person has to think about, what is my blood glucose level? They have to look at their pump to see how much insulin was dosed. They have to think about what happened in the hours before, what's happening in the hours to come, and why do they have to do all this work and think about the timing? Well, insulin is not instantaneous. It lives and acts in your body for 6 to 7 hours, and it peaks in 60 to 90 minutes. But food hits in 15 minutes. So if you sat down to breakfast and ate and dosed your insulin at the same time, you're going to have a spike in your blood sugar, unless you woke up and dosed your insulin before you walked down the stairs to breakfast an hour later. So you can start to see that, wow, this is actually a harder problem than most people think about. And the reality is, there's so many things that we don't know how to measure, how to control that impact your blood sugar. So you might hear that I've got a little bit of a chest cold going on. How do I know how that impacts my blood sugar? You don't know how to predict or really dose for that because it's changing all the time through the course of that cold. I just have to kind of respond and react to that. But there's also things like jet lag and exercise and activity and dehydration and stress and excitement and hormones and growth and all these other things that impact your blood sugar that you just kind of have to respond to. So it's really, really hard. And so throughout the day, there's dozens of, if not hundreds of times a day, a person with diabetes, type 1 diabetes in particular, if they're on insulin, and those type 2 people who also take insulin, who have to do these calculations and have to do all this work while living their lives, right? While working, while taking care of their kids, while doing everything else. It's really hard and more complex than you think. So this is why having a computer do this job for you is so much better, right? Why don't we automate this? And that's actually something that we've done, but you put the computer in the middle so it can look at the glucose data, it can look at the insulin dosing data and say, okay, you're predicted to go low based on your blood sugar trend, give less insulin. So it basically takes that dumb pump and makes it smart. Well, in 2013, this system did not exist. This idea of automating your diabetes, about making the pump smart, it was an idea and companies were working on it, but we were told it'll be out in the next couple of years. Just wait. Well, when you're living with diabetes every single day, that can be really, really hard and really, really frustrating, especially for me, because I would sleep through my continuous glucose monitor alarm. So my dumb pump would keep dosing me insulin, my alarm would be alarming, and I wouldn't wake up to it. So that's actually what got me all into this, was thinking, well, I can call the companies and ask them for a louder alarm, but they would say it'll be out in another 2 to 3 years. Well, that wasn't satisfactory. I was tired of being told to wait, to be patient as a patient, but I also thought, what could I do, because I was just a patient. So I started actually by just trying to get my data off my glucose monitor in order to send it to the cloud and down to my phone to make a louder alarm. I was helped by somebody who figured out how to reverse engineer and get the data off the device, which was really, really great. Then I built my louder alarm system. Then we met somebody else who could talk to the insulin pump, and we realized, oh, we can actually build this system and take some of the burden off of me. So instead of me thinking about my blood sugar hundreds of times a day and making these actions, we can put the computer in the middle. And that's exactly what we did, and that's what the system looks like. And that's what I'm wearing actually on my hip. This is what I call my artificial pancreas. It's a small computer, this little green board that talks between the dumb pump and the CGM, because the pump still, to this day, does not know what my blood sugar is. And it tells the pump, hey, she's going low, give her less insulin. Or hey, she's rising from the adrenaline of standing in front of a room full of people, give her a little more insulin. And this is actually a visualization of what happens with these tools. The green line is the blood sugar. The blue line is actually the insulin delivery. The dotted line is what I would be programmed to get. But you can see, even with a somewhat flat line on the screen, there's a lot of ups and downs there, because every 5 minutes, it's drawing a prediction into the future based on the dynamics of food and the 6 hours of insulin activity and everything that's going on, and saying, okay, here's the prediction, you're gonna go low, let's give you less insulin. Okay, that prediction changed because here comes a hormone rush. Doesn't matter why, let's give you more insulin. And it's able to do this every 5 minutes. And this worked really, really well for me. Granted, this was N of 1, but we're like, you know what? Once other people hear that I'm doing this, other people are gonna wanna do this too. And we think it is safer for us to share our knowledge with other people versus them having to recreate the wheel with everything that we learned and everything we designed for safety. Because guess what? As a person with diabetes, I care about safety more than anybody on the planet. I promise you. I care more than my doctor. I care more than the FDA. I care more than any researcher who's ever looked at diabetes. So we designed for safety, and we wanted other people to be safe as well. So when we decided to share our work, we decided to start with actually what we call a reference design, which is our safety design, walking through, here's the safety engineering that we did, using software limits and hardware limits so that nobody sets this up without understanding what they're doing and making sure that they do know what they're doing if they set it up. And we call this project OpenAPS, which stands for the Open Source Artificial Pancreas System. And the reference design, like I talked about, is available at openaps.org if you want to get into all the semantics of this. But the reason I share this and talk about the story of the process of how I got from there to where I am today is to help you understand that as a patient, we are told to wait for the product to come to market. And it takes time because reasons, right? Randomized controlled trial, FDA approval, nobody's gonna come to market with a wheel when they're trying to sell a car, right? The same thing with the closed loop system. There were people who were working on it. There were companies who were working on it, right? And we were told to wait. But you know what? It got really, really tired and frustrating. To deal with our problems, with me, just even hearing my CGM alarms was a huge struggle and a huge burden. Remote monitoring exists. My loved ones couldn't see my data. There was actually a whole stack of problems. And I loved what Eric did with the visual about the assumptions, because between the wheel and the car, there's a lot of assumptions about what the problems are and how you design and solve for those. And what we did as patients is said, you know what, we would love a car, but we don't know how to build a car. However, we know that our goal is actually getting from point A to point B, right? And better and faster than walking. And we can't build a car even though we want one really, 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 really badly, but here's a plank of wood and some wheels. We can make a skateboard. It's not perfect, doesn't have air conditioning, but we can at least go from point A to point B faster, right? And then somebody else will come along and say, hey, if you add steering, you can, steer and control a little bit better. And you end up with a scooter, and you progress and you progress and you progress. And that's the difference between patient-developed solutions is we can't wait for perfection. We can't wait 5 years. We can't afford to wait. Our lives are at risk every single day and living with type 1 diabetes. When you are diagnosed, you're given a vial of insulin, right? That is the fix for diabetes. You don't make insulin, we give you insulin. But that vial of insulin dosed at the wrong time or for factors outside of your control could kill you at night. That happens, right? That is really, really scary and really, really risky and really, really frustrating to live with day in and day out. And so waiting for that car to come to market is not satisfactory. And this is really empowering because once you realize that you can do something yourself, you can iterate and you know, no, it's not perfect. No, it's not gonna work for everybody, but it's gonna work for me and it might work for somebody else, so you wanna share it. So that's where a lot of this patient-led, user-led research comes from, is from desperation of nobody's going to come and save me. I have to save myself, I have to do it myself. But because we've been able to do all this stuff, I had a DIY closed loop system back at the end of 2014. This was 3 years before the first commercial hybrid closed loop system was approved by the FDA and came to the commercial market. 3 years is a really long time. In those 3 years, I had the flu. My nephew gave me and 17 other adults the norovirus one Thanksgiving. In January, I fell off a mountain and broke my ankle in 3 places. And you know what? I didn't have any issues with diabetes in any of those scenarios. I've also run marathons and done all kinds of active stuff. I've scuba dived, like you name it, I've done it with a closed loop system to the point where diabetes is not my biggest concern in my life anymore. I also have celiac disease, and eating gluten-free is a way bigger pain in the butt than type 1 diabetes, which most people probably wouldn't believe, but if you have a loved one with a food allergy or a food sensitivity or something like celiac disease, you probably get it, but for everybody else you don't understand. My now husband didn't even understand for the longest time. He thought diabetes was a bigger burden. And it was really only in the last 2 years out of us knowing each other for 6 years that he was like, yeah, I get it now. Type 1 diabetes is pretty much solved. Like, it's kind of in maintenance mode. You've taken care of the worst of that, but like, we need somebody to fix celiac because that's a pain in the butt. But that's why I get really, really frustrated when people say, you're not this or that. If I'm talking to a healthcare audience, I say, well, you're not a doctor. Who are you to be building something that works for yourself and telling other people that they too could find a solution that works for them? In a room full of researchers, I often have somebody thinking, well, you're not a traditional researcher. You don't have a PhD. You don't know all the names of all the fancy methods for all the things that you're doing. And I'm like, yeah, so what? Because no, I'm not a traditional researcher. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an engineer by training. I actually come from a communications background. But the day you're diagnosed with diabetes, like I said, you're given that vial insulin, good luck, you're sent home, you have to figure it out or you will die. When you're a patient, it is that simple. If you do not figure it out, you will die. So we're not traditionally or potentially professionally employed as these things, although there's many people in these professions who do happen to have type 1 diabetes, but as a population, we're not necessarily going to have all those roles. But that doesn't mean we're not engineering solutions and we're not doing scientific experiments. Every day with type 1 diabetes is like a dozen scientific experiments. What happens when I'm jet lagged to my blood sugars? What happens when I forget to inject my insulin at the time of my meal or before or whatever you normally do? What happens when you're dehydrated? What happens when you break a bone with type 1 diabetes? Nobody knew until I fell off the mountain and we watched all the data and could see exactly what happens with the physiological response. So we do become scientists and researchers and all these things because we have to. And I think as researchers, it's really important, and people who care about digital health, to not fall into what I call the patient syndrome trap. And you're probably like, whoa, that's a method I've never heard of. You're right, because I made that one up. But it's kind of like imposter syndrome, right? Where like I feel like imposter syndrome right now because I'm in a room of experts in digital and mobile health. We're doing all this cool stuff with fancy methods that I don't know the names for. And so, right, y'all all know way more than I could possibly do about all that stuff. Sure. In healthcare, though, we have this curious phenomenon where once we think of somebody as a patient, we have all these stereotypes and we put them in a box and we're like, patients know nothing. Or if they know something, healthcare researchers, healthcare professionals, doctors, they know it all and so much more, right? This is what healthcare looks like. Patients know a little bit. Healthcare as a whole knows everything else. But what the reality is patients know a ton of stuff. I have learned so much stuff about sickness, about growth spurts, about hormones, about all this stuff because I've had the sensors and the data and the time to look at it over the past 4.5 years now. That's something that's totally been overlooked by the healthcare space in diabetes because they haven't had the tools to look at it. But I built the tools to enable us to look at that. And so guess what? I know a lot and it's being overlooked if I was just gonna sit back and be a patient and let traditional healthcare, do their thing. And so this is what we need to get to, is recognizing that yes, researchers know a lot and they have some cool methods which are great for some things, but it's going back to that small data paradigm, right? Patients actually know a lot and there's some overlap, but we're missing so much more, right? We're missing so much knowledge that can be created and shared and scaled, and yes, that needs to be tested and reproduced, and we can take your methods and throw it at this knowledge and go to town. Go for it. It's not an either or, it's an and, it's a yes and. It's how can we leverage all of this? Because then we'll get to solutions, we'll get to cures, we'll get to treatments, we'll get to everything better. And so Eric already talked about the 1-9-90 model, and I think it's really common for people to look at me and be like, okay, that's just you, right? You're a one-off, you're different, you're special, you're weird, you're whatever you want to call me. It's just you. Well, what if you think about us as the 1% and realize that, well, 1% of all people with diabetes is actually a big number of people, right? And don't these 1% of people deserve something better than the status quo if they're unsatisfied? But also, what if these 1% aren't just the 1%? What if we're the undiscovered rule? And this is how I actually got into doing research myself. I consider myself to be an independent researcher now. I'm actually a grant-funded researcher. And part of this evolved from researchers reaching out to me after they would hear me talk and say, hey, you know, you're a person with diabetes, you're public about it. Can I see your data and look at it and research on it? And I always felt really awkward and uncomfortable about it because, number one, I care about my privacy in a weird way that you wouldn't probably expect. But also, I don't represent the community of people doing this any more than I feel like I could say me or my data represents all people with diabetes, right? Like, I'm not representative, so it's really weird to feel that people would be looking at my data and using that to basically, I don't know, make judgments or conclusions about the safety, the efficacy, the whatever it is that they're looking at. And the reality is, this is not just me doing this. So OpenAPS started in February of 2015, so it's been several years now. And at a very conservative count, we know that there's more than 1,400 people who are doing this worldwide. And that's a super underestimate. That's just humans who filled out a form. So realistically, based on social media data, it's probably more like 3,000 people. And over time, if you do a really conservative estimate of whether people are just using it at night or during the day, we think we have more than 13 million hours of real world experience with this technology. Why do I throw this number up? Why do I talk about this? Well, it's to contextualize that most of the randomized clinical control trials for the technology that goes to the FDA for approval or other regulatory bodies, those have about 150,000 hours of data. If they're lucky. 150,000 hours of experience saying this technology works. We have 13 million and probably way more than that hours, and not just like each hour of data is perfect or great or whatever, but the fact that people choose to go on this, and even with the burdens of having to do it themselves, they continue to pick it up every day and put it on and carry it around with them. There's something really powerful there that works for them. And it could work for them for any number of reasons. And it's not always about the clinical outcomes, it's also often about the quality of life. People have different reasons. A parent of a child with diabetes might have a different reason than I do as an adult. But the point of this is, we have a lot of data. It's being completely thrown away by the traditional healthcare research establishment, right? Because this is real world patient-generated data. We can't trust this data. We don't know that it works, blah, 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 blah. So what we did to address some of these criticisms is says, okay, well, we need to find a way to let you look at this data. So we started using a platform called OpenHumans, which you might have heard about. We created a project to allow people to anonymously donate their data in there. Do we have 13 million hours of data? No. We have about 150 people right now who've donated their data. I have a new tool launching next week that'll pull data in real time, so I expect that data to scale a lot. But the point of this is we have data, it's accessible for anybody who meets our criteria to research with it, and we have a lot of peer-reviewed studies. This is just a sampling of them. It's out of date. I have like 4 more to add to this. And we've studied everything from looking at the clinical outcomes of people who are doing this DIY off-label thing, and you can see before, after, you get better results. All the studies in every population around the world, Korea, Italy, UK, Australia, US, global mixed population, everybody's getting the same results. Blood sugar goes down, bad categories go down. But what I think is really, really cool is that what we've been able to research is actually so much more. Most of the traditional researchers just want to look like, are you safe? Have you died? Well, nobody's died and nobody's been harmed. And yes, the outcomes are good, but we can start peeling back so much noise now and actually look at some underlying physiological concepts of what's actually happening in the body when there's a teenage boy who's going through a growth spurt, right? What happens when somebody's dealing with pregnancy? What happens when somebody breaks a bone? What happens with everyday sickness and colds and everything else? The tools we have, even with the closed loop, they're still not perfect. There's still more that we can do. And because we are already solving for a lot of the noise with the closed loop, we can actually better understand, how does somebody's insulin sensitivity change over time? It's not static. It's not even static on a day-to-day basis, even when you're perfectly kind of healthy and in your normal situation. There's so much that we can learn from this. So my question to you is to really think about, what could we change? And what would happen if we actually enable patients to prioritize what we're researching and how we're designing our studies? Because I don't think we've seriously in the healthcare world asked this question enough. I think we've done focus groups. We've like patted people on the head and said, it's nice that you're doing your own thing. We haven't really worked together and said, like, okay, what is important to you and your community and your health, and why don't we research that together and figure out a way that brings all of y'all's expertise and the best of the big data and the small data together. And I also think we need to really think about resources too, because most of the patients who are getting patted on the head for doing research are doing this in their spare time for free, because they're trying to find something to work that works for them, or they're trying to give a gift to the community with the skills that they've developed to say, here's a piece of knowledge that I want to study more and to help you figure out. But we really need to think about resources, both in terms of funding, and not just like, hey, here's $5, thanks for filling out my survey, but really thinking about funding for people's times and expertise as they do this work, and also thinking about data and other tools and resources. I kind of have like some recommendations in terms of if you're going to work with patients, what you should and should not do. But I would say as a resource for you, Eric Heckler is actually a great resource, because he's been co-PI with me on a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for about the last year and a half, and we've learned a lot of interesting things working together. I think he came in expecting to almost treat me like a PhD student in terms of like being able to give me the skills and the methods and the fancy names in order to help me do more research, right? And that's a terrible paraphrase, but it's meant with it's meant with love. Right. But if you go read a lot of our blog posts, Eric has been phenomenally humble in sharing his experiences and what it's been like to actually work together. All of us PIs have actually written some really candid and open blog posts about what I've learned going into the traditional academic system as somebody from outside an organization, not a PhD, not a research, not all those things. And for Eric and the other co-PIs to say, wow, this is really different than what I expected, right? It was no longer about, let me give you my skills and my terminology, but really figuring out, wow, there's a lot of institutional barriers and a lot of systemic barriers that we need to break down to work together. And one of the best gifts Eric and others have given to me is they said, we'll take on the institutional stupidity, right? Like, we'll go bang our head against a brick wall so you can focus on the science, which is awesome. And I think that's one of the really, really valuable things that you can do. And I would say, just kind of as a general rule, remember that we will have different motivations than you. The people that you work with, whether they're in a community or they're a patient community, we will have different motivations. We will also have different timelines. And one of the most important things you can do is calibrate on pace and expectations. Because you might take on a project and work with a patient or community, and that could be like 1/30th of your workload, right? Totally recognize that. But it's really important to be upfront, because that might be that patient's one big project, that one thing. And so if this is like 1/30th of your workload and they're expecting you to like focus on it like it's your number one, there's going to be some misexpectations and misunderstandings in terms of timelines, response rates, who's doing what, things like that. So it can be really, really valuable to calibrate on pace and expectations, and also recognize that just because you have some skills, patients come into this with all kinds of learned skills and experiences and whatever. Most of the time people look at me and completely ignore that I had a professional and still do have a professional career outside my research work. I understand how to work with organizations, right? I managed internal communications for a large nonprofit health system. I understand how to communicate, how to work with organizational politics, but it's really hard when you don't sit inside the organization. But so people conveniently forget all the skills or ignore all the skills that a person has and are just like, well, you're a patient, like here's your box, and like we have to build you up to be where we think you should go. No, expect that they will absolutely learn a lot, but so will you, and it will be to your mutual benefits to work together. But I think my biggest take-home message for you is to say, start thinking earlier about how to involve those patients, those community members with you. Don't tack them on at the end of the grant and be like, hey, so what do you think of our grant design that we've already submitted to IRB? Right? Like, that's too late. You need to start back at what do we research? Why are we researching? How are we researching? How are we designing this? Is this ethical? And it's just kind of a side note here, and I know we'll talk about ethics later today, IRB does not mean it's ethical, right, for the community. That's one thing that I've kind of seen as a general thing across healthcare, is that people think it's IRB approved, therefore it's ethical and it's the right thing to do. That doesn't necessarily match up. And so working with people early on of, is this the right thing to do? Is this the right way to work with the community? That's a really important conversation to have early on, not just afterwards when then you're like, well, it's so hard to amend the IRB paperwork, you don't want to do it because it's hard. And so kind of again, coming back to this visual, the other thing I would recommend to you is I think it's really easy to think about, well, we should research the car, right? That's the product, that's the intervention, that's the whatever, but going back to Eric's visual, you kind of miss all the assumptions along the way, but if you start earlier, you can start testing each of those modular components and testing those assumptions, and you'll probably learn a lot about the fundamentals that you don't know, the community doesn't know, and it's a huge contribution to science and that generalizable big data body of knowledge. Like, we miss so much by focusing at the end of the process instead of starting at the beginning, testing those assumptions, and looking at that. So I will pause there because I have no idea how I am on time, but I would just say kind of my mantra, this is a hashtag that's come out of the diabetes community, but I think applies to most of the patients in the community, is we are not waiting because we cannot afford to wait. Like, if you've ever looked at diabetes, you might think, oh, like, yeah, whatever, it's not cancer, right? It's not a big deal. Well, diabetes is a big deal to the people who are living with it. I am at risk every single day walking around with this vial of insulin. It could kill me. It's also the thing that keeps me alive. It's dangerous, it's risky, it's scary. We can't afford to wait for something better, which is why we decided to do something ourselves. And it's so wonderful to be in a room of researchers who care about this, who care about doing better research, coming up with better models and everything. But I would say don't hesitate to ask questions now or in the future from me, from Eric, what it was like to work with us, what he's learned from us. But also, there's a lot of patients out there who don't know how to get started, who would love to work with you. It's not just the ones who happen to be super vocal, being super out there. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of people out there that you could work with. And so I would encourage you to think about how you might involve them in some of your work going forward. And I'll pause there and see what questions come to mind and maybe follow up on that question about community versus patient. Questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
So, as the big the companies are sort of creeping up on you with they've got the new things coming out, do they help you at all?
In the early days, they did it as more of a PR effort, but they didn't really do anything with that. And to their credit, it's because the medical device development cycle is super long and super slow. So they had been working on technology for 10 years,
right.
And what they first brought to market was like baked 10 years ago. So what we're doing then couldn't really influence that. We're really influencing the second generation of products. So we do have companies that are now starting to listen and starting to incorporate, and I think that'll be a big market differentiator in the second generation of systems that come to market. There's actually been a company that's based in France that's taken our code, because it's licensed open source for anybody to use, including for this purpose, have run simulations on it and said, oh, that like in a third of the times, you do better catching these weird edge cases for safety than we do. Whoa, let's pull this in. And they actually wrote in code to match our ideas around how do you safely deal with all those edge cases for safety, which is awesome. Like, that's exactly what we wanted to have. This was not about like, we're gonna take over the world of diabetes devices and build companies. No, like, I would love to give up diabetes as my side hobby and side job. So it's really, really great to see that, but I don't think we're there yet in terms of all the companies truly leveraging all the patient knowledge, all the patient data, all the patient research. And I think we still have a ways to go there.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
That is, what's the one thing that the companies are not listening to? Because we're now working with some of the newer devices, and I'm dumbfounded at some of the shit they don't do.
I think the hard thing is some of the companies have one device with one set of data and they don't have access to the other data. So the beautiful thing about our data set is you can have any set of devices uploading to that, right? So you can have company A device, company B device, married together, and you have contextual real world data that's like, hey, I was sick, this is what I did, here was my exercise, whatever. Not always, but you've got enough to really build up a big, small data set, right? And it's really funny when people say N of one data, like they think that it's small. I personally have been doing this for 4.5 years, right? I have millions of hours of data personally coming from all my devices. I don't think that's small data, but people disregard that real world data as saying, well, it's real world, you know, we can't validate it, whatever, and they basically throw it out and ignore it. And so I think that's kind of a major missing thing is they're not pairing any of the real world data with the data they have from their one single device. And I think they're missing out on a lot of contextual insights there.
Any questions over here, Camille?
Dana, I always love listening to your talk, so this was just a pleasure to hear you. I'm thinking about the iterative approach, and research should start at that iterative front end, but very few organizations, entities fund that formative research.
Mm-hmm.
I think FDA is starting to put the patient at the front end. I've just read something that talks about how important that qualitative part of the process is. I haven't really delved into it, but do you have ideas about where the funding is going to come from to do the work that actually really needs to happen, which is what you just presented? So the funding is my question. Where will you go next?
So that's a really good question. So I ended up getting the grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and then starting to get some other grants where, like, again, I'm not affiliated with any academic institution, so that's why I consider myself an independent researcher. Happen to have a couple of these grants, but I don't feel like I can answer that question for those of y'all who are thinking from the academic perspective where to go to get that money. I think Eric and then Gary Wolf would be good people to have that conversation about, because they're thinking about how do you fund both the community side as well as the academic side, but I feel like I'm a little bit too in the weeds on my personal story of that to like have a good scale answer for that. But it's a really good question, because I think funding is important for both the small data and those communities and the people doing that work, as well as obviously to empower your work as well.
Just for everybody's information, Gary Wolf, who she just mentioned, heads up the quantified self.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dana. This is great to hear. Just wanted, if you could explain a little bit the type of data that you've been collecting and also the technology and how you go about using it, just to sort of put a few things.
Everybody probably didn't hear that question, so
I'll repeat. Yeah, so the question is about what data do we have and what devices we're using. We have glucose data coming from the continuous glucose monitor. Every 5 minutes, I get a data point on this device. I also have all the data coming from my insulin pump. And then I also have data that's being generated by the algorithm in terms of the predictions of what's going to happen, the recommendations for insulin dosing, what actually got dosed, as well as some other calculations we do around how your insulin sensitivity changes over time and a bunch of new variables and new novel ways to calculate that. All that's captured on the device, uploaded to the cloud, and then if and when I or others choose to donate it, that all goes in 4 data files to this data commons, which is then accessible to researchers.
And do you report your activity?
People can upload their activity that's not in the diabetes data set. People can add that on when they upload, but most people aren't, just because there's not been a really practical way to use that. And what I've learned I used to hate self-tracking, and I still will not self-track anything unless I can see immediate impact from that data. So I track my sleep, because every morning I look at that and I can kind of use that data to inform, wow, I've not been getting enough sleep. And sleep is actually something, I'm like one of those people who need 12 hours of sleep, not the 5 hours of sleep person. So I can use that data score to help me kind of design my day to say, I need to go to bed early tonight because I am sleep deprived, and that influences everything else, so that drives me. But there's a lot of things like heart rate and activity for a lot of people where they don't get that real-time signal, and 6 years away when somebody might want to use that data is not relevant to them, so they're not going to, even if they happen to be collecting it on a watch or a phone, they may not put it with our data set because there's not kind of that short-term feedback loop. So I think we need to get better about thinking about how do we provide people some kind of feedback, even if the research outcomes are long off, to help them kind of reward them for the hassle of uploading that data. Because I think that's a big gap for those of us who aren't really quantified self people, other than the fact that I have to be. But I don't track anything that I don't have to track, that I don't get a benefit out of. But I think there's other people out there like that as well, and we need to do a better job closing the gap. Yeah.
Any other questions? Then I'm going to hand it over to Daniel. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.